Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today, our special guest is Peter Nolan. He's a retired television newsman. He's been broadcasting for about 30 years, 5 in radio, and most of the 25 years at Channel 5. Peter, welcome to our program.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Tell us about your book, Campaign, in 1983. What a year to be talking about your book.
Well, it was 1983. I was a reporter who covered this campaign, and it was for mayor of the city of Chicago. There were 3 candidates in the Democratic primary. The incumbent was a woman by the name of Jane Byrne, who had become Chicago's first woman mayor.
Yes.
In 1979. She defeated the Democratic organization or machine, and she ran for re-election, and there were 2 Democrats got in the primary opposing her. One was a man named Richard M. Daley, who later became the mayor, but in this time he didn't make it. And the 3rd candidate was Harold Washington, who ultimately won that Democratic primary, and he won the general election. And he became the city's first black African-American mayor. And it was quite a crazy campaign. You know, I think of what's going on today. It's maybe even crazier, but this was quite a wild campaign. Very contentious. Now, the system is different today. Today they have a nonpartisan election, supposedly, where you can have as many candidates, and the top 2 vote getters then run off in the general election.
Right.
There's no party labels. But in this case, there was a Democratic primary and there was a Republican primary, but that nobody paid much attention to.
Because
the Democrat usually wins. There hadn't been a Republican mayor of Chicago in 50 years, I think it was. It was in the 20s. Anyway, there was a Republican candidate. And then when you had this black man wins the Democratic primary, there's a white candidate available. Mm-hmm. And that is the Republican candidate. So it became very racially charged, right. You know, and in the end, this Republican candidate almost won the election, but Harold Washington prevailed and became the city's first black mayor. But it was really
monumental.
Wonderful, not wonderful, but it was quite a story.
Phenomenal.
And I wanted to write about it, so years later, I wrote a book about it.
And you covered it that time.
I did, yes.
And now, so when doing the research, do you find it to be easier to do research, or is it harder?
Well, I think it probably, if I was doing it and knew nothing about it, it would be harder to. But that's what historians do, you know, they get all the documents and everything. Right. But I had been a witness to a lot of this. Not everything, but I covered the candidates and debates and rallies and covered them walking on the streets.
Right,
so I was a witness to it.
And did you find that researching, or you received some footage, you say, from maybe Channel 5?
NBC was kind enough to send me a lot of the video from that campaign, which I was able to review. I used some of it for photos for the book, still photos. And the other thing was that it was very helpful to me was I kept all my scripts all the stories that I wrote about it. I kept them. Mm-hmm. What I didn't have was what was said in the sound bites.
Yes.
Because the script, all it says is a sound bite. There's no.
There's no actual quote.
So that's why I needed to sometimes get the video. A lot of times I could remember what was said. Or I could then go to newspaper accounts of what happened and get that information from there.
So at the time of the experience, this campaign, did you think you would write a book?
I kind of did. I think I said, this is somebody, I got to write about this someday. This is really crazy, you know? So it was,
and keeping the scripts then, because
I think I probably, in the back of my head, kept these scripts for a reason. That I always liked to write, and I think I always had the idea of writing a book.
And this script was paper. I mean, we're not talking about digital records
yeah.
back
There was
then, right?
nothing on any electronic computers or anything. I wrote the book on a computer, but the stuff that I had was all paper.
So when you say you have some photos that you could use in a book, did you have to get Channel 5 to release rights, or did you have to purchase rights? You know, that's often a question that our viewers have.
Well, that's true. You know, I know some other authors that try to get some pictures from newspapers, and you have to pay for them now. It used to be, you know, the business has changed so much. These newspapers and a lot of media companies are struggling.
Yes.
So they have to look for ways to make money. Now, fortunately, when I was doing this, Channel 5 was not, I don't know how they were kind enough to, you know, release and I would put, in the book it says courtesy of WMAQ-TV,
I see.
NBC. I don't know if they would give you, because they, you know, people have said, you got to sell this stuff. This is, you know, you own it, and
historical records.
But in the old days of writing, I think they would, the newspapers and TV would let you have that if they got a credit.
Yes.
Because they, you know, they were all viable. Now today, you know, the industry has changed.
So about when was that? You say that they gave you this, maybe, when did you start working on it?
Well, I'm going to say this would have been in the early 2000.
2000, yeah. When you're writing this book, who was in your mind, your audience?
Oh, you know, I probably didn't think that through at all. I wasn't thinking about the audience. Now that I think back on it, I probably would have been people that are interested in politics.
Yes.
But I didn't. I probably should have been more astute at thinking that through, but I didn't. I'll tell you one thing that I did do is I interviewed quite a few people for the book, and that process took on kind of a life of its own. I started out trying to get some aldermen, and I had trouble getting the aldermen today have staffs, and I couldn't get them, so I wound up interviewing people that were at lower levels in the campaign. I interviewed a policeman who was a driver for mayor, for Daley before he was mayor.
How interesting.
Yeah, I interviewed people that were precinct captains, and they were very interesting. So these were the
and
people.
this was more recent. You mean these are?
Oh yeah, this was when I was writing
right?
it. Yeah, this was long after the campaign.
But how do you find those people? I mean, even the names, who we would know,
well,
you know, as a regular person, who would be the driver?
One of the first guys that I interviewed was a man named James Sheehan. Skinny, his nickname is Skinny Sheehan. And he's kind of a legendary political operative out on the south side of Chicago in the 19th Ward. He has a radio show now. He retired. He was a Daily guy, and he worked. When Daily got in eventually in 1989. Skinny got a great job. He was the head of McCormick Place, and he had that job. He's retired now.
Okay.
But anyway, he was my first interview, and he was terrific. I mean, he knew all about the Daley campaign, and And then let's see.
It sounds like you had to use some of your skills as a newsman and
Oh
do
yeah,
some
yeah.
research.
In doing these interviews, yeah, yeah, that was helpful. And so anyway, the thing came together, and I published it.
Did you have any trouble finding a publisher?
Oh yeah, I did. I eventually wound up. I had been in a writers group. Okay, and
Where was it? Wilmette or
locally.
North?
Well, it was guys from the North Shore mainly. They're all writers. The one guy who was in it was a man named Jay Amberg, who's quite a prolific writer. He's written a lot of books, and he started a publishing company, and with a man named John Manos. And when they started out, it was kind of like what they called self-publishing, although they call it independent now. And but they were able to publish it's called Amica Press. They've done quite a bit of.
Heard
of them?
Amica,
Yeah, they
yes.
probably. And so they published the book. I remember the Southern Illinois University Press wanted to publish it, or at least the editor there, and I was kind of excited about that. And then I got a letter from him. He said that his bosses said they didn't want to publish it because they don't make any money on these books.
Yes. Well, they have to balance it out. So you met Jay Ambers at a writers group.
Yeah, I had known him before. Jay Amberg was a long-time teacher at Glenbrook South, English teacher.
Really? Okay.
He's a PhD in English, and I had met him through another writer friend of mine, Bob Boone, who was actually my next-door neighbor at one time, and I had known Jay Amberg for years.
And that's very interesting because Glenview seems to be full of writers. Your neighbor and I know I met some of our guests, our neighbors as well. We met each other at the block party.
Yeah.
So could you?
Is anybody making any money?
It's depending on what you call it. Making a lot of money. Sometimes I think some people win awards, and that may be more than what you're selling per book. But it's very interesting. How did you find living in Glenview as a writers? Do you think it's helpful to be living in Glenview as a writer?
It was very helpful. What was helpful was the library. They did a lot of stuff. Every time I would need something, well, one of the things was you could get access to the newspaper archives through our library.
That's true.
Online.
Oh, yes.
Okay, and so you didn't have to
go anywhere.
Anytime I'd go into the library, they were more. In fact, I gave them some credit in the book in the acknowledgments.
Yes.
And it was just terrific. Now, I didn't know any writers from Glenview, so Glenview is like my second home. I raised my family in Glencoe I was there for 25 years.
Yes.
And raised 6 children. They all went to New Trier. So now my grandchildren, a lot of my children ended up in Glenview. And so my grandchildren are in GBS.
That's great.
So I didn't meet any writers here. Most like Jay Amberg, he's from Evanston, but my Bob Boone, who's another PhD in English and has written is an author, he was my next door neighbor in Glencoe.
Yes. Well, so is a copy of your book available at the Glenview Library?
It is, yeah.
So our viewers can check it out.
Yeah.
That's great. Now, you say you're looking forward to writing another nonfiction.
I'm working on a book called News Stories. And what it is it's a lot of offbeat stories that I found kind of, compelling, interesting. There's a lot of interesting characters involved. They weren't these big newsy stories, but just interesting people.
Features, right?
Yeah. And so, for example, I got a story about a political guy on the South Side who worked for President Kennedy, him and his friends.
Wow.
And they, when Kennedy was elected, they'd meet down on Saturday nights. They'd go meet in the guy's basement and drink beer and talk politics. And one night, the guy says, "Let's call the president." They called the White House, and they want to talk to President Kennedy. And this guy was an official in the city of Chicago, and they, at the time, if somebody identified themselves as a public official, they went to a special operator at the White House. And the lady said, "Well, he's not available. Thanks for calling." Well, they started doing this a lot. And every Saturday night, and they could call and they want to talk to the president. We worked for him, you know, we love him and all that. And one night there's a knock on the door, and it's a Secret Service agent.
Oh my goodness.
And he said, you know, you can't be bothering us. We got to stop this, Mr.
Yeah.
His name was McGann, Andrew McGann. And so that ended the phone call. So there's little stories like
prank calling the president.
Yeah.
That is
I think it's, you know, I say you can't be bothering the president in the United States.
I see.
He's busy.
Well, it sure sounds like the political world was very different back then. And also, how about the newsroom? How was the newsroom different?
Well, you know, I don't know what it's like in the newsroom of today. One thing I think a lot about is in the newsroom of my era, we had time to think about things before we put them on the air.
Right.
There wasn't this 24-hour news cycle. We had, I think, an hour at 5 o'clock, and then there was the NBC nightly news, and then we had local another half hour. Then we had another show at 10 o'clock.
At night. Yeah.
At night.
Yes.
So you had, when news happened, people said stuff, you had time to think about, do we really, is this news here? Or
yes.
Is it? Now it's all, it all goes on. That's the difference.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, somebody told me at the newspaper, with the computers now, everything is on. People are looking at, and they're looking at these little phones all the time. That it's very quiet. Nobody.
Oh.
And it used to be in my day, the newsroom was loud. There was a lot of yelling, and I didn't agree with your story. I'd say, yeah, that's a lot of baloney. There'd be a lot of action going on.
People actually talk to each other, discuss.
You actually spoke to each other.
Yes.
And
I also hear that the newsrooms used to sound like, because of the typewriters constantly.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a certain energy and vibe of working
and then
together.
The other thing with the noise, in addition to the typewriters, was these, it kept going all the time, were these wire service machines. The Associated Press, United Press, we had all the Reuters. And these machines were clacking all the time in the newsroom. Yeah. And I mean, I'm talking about 24 hours.
Yes.
They'd quiet down late at night, but all day long they were sending news stories over the wire, and it was all paper.
Yes, and I heard about this too in the modern newsroom. They're trying to.
Am I that old?
No. Well, I think the phones and computers have changed dramatically, and people don't feel the same vibe of community information.
I think maybe that's one of the missing things. It was kind of an exciting, the newsroom in those days was kind of an exciting place to be.
Yes.
And it was fun. I had a lot of fun. It's fun to go to work every day, but I'm hoping I can finish this book.
Well, this book is
about halfway done.
What is a vignette, right? It's a
short stories.
Right?
It's a collection of short stories. Yes.
And Amica will be your publisher again?
I hope so. Yeah, I haven't talked to him lately. But.
Well, I thought usually you talk to the publisher while it's
Oh
in
yeah,
process.
I've talked to them, yeah, about it, and they know about it, and I think I hope that, but they have to look at it and see if they want to publish it.
Can you share us another story from your book?
From the new book, yeah, news stories. Well, one of them that I've told to a lot of people that people seem to like a lot is about a guy I knew who was in World War II. His name was John Rossi. He owned a restaurant in Chicago by the name of the House of Bertini. And he was just a young soldier and landed on D-Day at Utah Beach. And he was with an engineering battalion, and they went into France, and their job was to cut down these huge hedgerows that were divided farms in France for centuries. They'd see sporadic combat. One of his buddies got wounded, but a lot of times they would see aerial combat, and they would run. If they'd see a German plane get shot down in the pilot parachute, they'd run because they want to capture his weapon, because they could sell it to their own officers. And there was one guy from Hamtramck High School in Detroit, in the auto industry, and he was always at the head of the pack, and he'd capture, get the gun. And so this one day they see the German pilot bailing out, and their buddy is in the lead, and they stop because they see him. He embraces the German pilot, and they're dancing around, and they get up there. What's going on? He says, "This is my buddy. I went to Hamtramck High School with this guy, this German pilot."
Wow.
It turned out the German pilot had been grown up in the States. His father was an engineer in the auto industry, but he was a big Hitler fan. And when Hitler came to power, they went back to Germany. The kid went to college. And John said this guy spoke perfect English. And they're walking back to their camp, and one of their officers said, "Why isn't that prisoner in restraints?" They said, "It's okay, sir. He's a buddy at Tully's from Hamtramck High School."
Oh my goodness. What a story.
So you never know what's going to happen out there.
What are chances of that, right?
I know. Yeah, you just,
Well, Peter, thank you for being on the program with us.
Well, I appreciate you having me.
And thank you for watching. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.